April 7, 1945, dawn broke cold and misty over the small German town of Alan-Grabo, about 70 kilometers west of Berlin. Hedwig Miller, a 23-year-old woman exhausted from 3 years of service as a Hellfire's a female auxiliary in the Wehrmacht, stood frozen at the window of a derelict schoolhouse that had served as their dormitory for the last 6 months. What she saw through the broken glass shattered everything she had been taught about the American enemy. Instead of the savage hordes described in Der Stieue Ormer and the degenerate gangsters portrayed in propaganda films, she saw something unimaginable. Columns of well-fed, well-equipped soldiers marched by, their uniforms neat and intact, their vehicles plentiful and functional. But it wasn't just their appearance that stunned her. It was their actions. American GIs were unloading crates from trucks, food, medicine, blankets, not the behavior of barbarians coming to loot and destroy, but of an army so well supplied they could afford to share with their conquered enemies. They moved like giants. Hedwig later wrote in her diary, not just in stature but in their casual confidence. These were men who had never known true hunger, and their trucks, so many trucks, more than Hedwig had ever seen in the entire war, kept coming endlessly. How had they fought such an enemy? What hope did Germany ever have? As she watched an American soldier hand chocolate to a group of exhausted German children, the terrible truth began to dawn on her. The Reich, which had promised 1,000 years of glory, couldn't even provide its people with soap. Yet here were their supposed inferiors, distributing more food in a single morning than she had seen in months. In that moment, as American military police established a perimeter around the auxiliary women's quarters to protect them from reprisals, Hedwig understood. They had been lied to about everything. The myth of German superiority collapsed before a reality she could neither deny nor explain away. Cartons of cigarettes, tins of coffee, white bread, and soldiers who smiled with all their teeth. The liberation of approximately 19,000 German women during the final months of World War II revealed a stark contrast between Nazi propaganda and the Allied reality. These women, often mislabeled as comfort women by Allied soldiers, ALs confusing their clerical and communications roles with the sexual slavery suffered by women under Imperial Japan in the Pacific, experienced a particularly disorienting form of defeat. Unlike male soldiers captured on the battlefield, these women witnessed the collapse of their worldview in slower, more intimate settings, with ample time to process the contradictions between what they had been told and what they now saw with their own eyes. The journey to this moment of revelation began years earlier, during the early days of National Socialist triumph. From 1933 onward, German propaganda carefully constructed an image of their Western opponents, particularly Americans, as racially mixed, morally corrupt, and materially weak. Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda produced over 1,000 films during the Nazi era, many explicitly portraying Americans as gangster-controlled degenerates, obsessed with money, and lacking the spiritual fortitude for serious warfare. In Der Weich Jude, released in 1940, Americans were depicted as puppets of Jewish financial interests, their material wealth portrayed as evidence of moral decay, rather than industrial strength. Germans who grew up in this propaganda environment had little access to contradictory information. Hedwig, like most of the women in the Wehrmacht, came of age during the Nazi period, entering school just as Hitler consolidated power. Her formative years coincided with the Reich's early successes, The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, the annexation of Austria in 1938, and the surrender of France in 1940. The apparent validation of Nazi predictions reinforced the credibility of their other claims, including their portrayal of American society. By 1941, over 100 Zauser German women were serving in military auxiliary roles, mainly as communications specialists, administrative assistants, and medical aides. Unlike the Soviet Union, which deployed women in combat roles such as snipers and pilots, Nazi Germany maintained strict gender separation in military functions, emphasizing women's supporting roles alongside male soldiers. German women received about 4 weeks of training, with pay ranging from 160 to 200 Reichsmarks per month. Adequate, but not generous. Their uniforms, designed by renowned fashion designer Hugo Schultz, Verrill, combined practicality with a feminine appearance, reflecting the regime's contradictory attitudes toward women's roles. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, German propaganda adjusted its portrayal of this new enemy. Americans were now depicted as materialistic but incompetent, possessing industrial might but lacking the racial strength and ideological resolve needed for victory. The Nazi newspaper Vue Loekischer Beobachter described American soldiers as cowboys and gangsters in uniform, incapable of matching the discipline of the German fighting man. Films like Am Kruger depicted Americans and the British as cruel colonizers, drawing parallels that suggested Germany would suffer similar brutality if defeated. Such messaging intensified as American forces approached German soil, with pamphlets warning of rape, pillage, and destruction. Mass executions were widely feared if American forces occupied German land. One widely circulated document warned that Americans, led by Jewish officers, were determined to exterminate the German race. For women like Hedwig and her fellow Hellerinnen, these rumors were particularly chilling, creating expectations of sexual violence and retribution. The reality they encountered, however, was dramatically different. Lieutenant Thomas Hardgrove of the 89th Infantry Division, U.S. Army, documented his first encounter with German auxiliary women near Isozino in April 1945. "We found about 30 German women in a communications bunker," he wrote in his field report. "They were terrified, clearly expecting the worst. Our interpreter explained they would be treated according to the Geneva Convention, and their relief was palpable. One woman broke down crying when offered a ration. She kept repeating, 'It's too much.' She was astonished at both the quantity and quality of the standard issue American combat rations." This encounter was typical throughout the closing months of the war. As American forces advanced through Western Germany, they encountered thousands of female auxiliaries who had not retreated with the German forces, either due to oversight or chaotic withdrawal, or by deliberate abandonment as the Wehrmacht collapsed. The Americans, adhering to established protocols for prisoners of war, generally set up separate detention facilities for these women, with female military police officers assigned when available. Gretchen Kohler, a signals auxiliary captured near Frankfurt, described her detention in a letter smuggled to her family. "We're held in a former hotel. Each of us has a real bed with clean sheets. We receive the same rations as American soldiers, more food than I've seen in a year. Yesterday, they gave out chocolate bars and cigarettes as if they were ordinary items. When I asked why they'd waste such luxuries on prisoners, the guard looked confused. 'Lady, this ain't luxury where we come from,' he said. 'This is just Tuesday.' This casual abundance was the first shock for many Hellerinnen. Throughout 1944 and 1945, German civilian rations had dwindled to about 1,500 calories per day, with actual distribution often falling below that meager level. Military personnel received slightly better rations, but by the war's final months, these were irregular. By contrast, American military rations provided about 300-600 calories daily for active personnel, with additional supplements often available. Even the basic ration for frontline combat conditions included items that had become rare luxuries in Germany: coffee, sugar, preserved meat, and chocolate. For prisoners used to meals of watery soup and bread of deteriorating quality, American rations represented not just adequate nutrition, but unimaginable abundance. This nutritional disparity highlighted deeper contrasts in industrial capacity. By 1944, American factories were producing more than 50,000 military vehicles each month. Germany's total production for the year was approximately 27,000. The United States manufactured over 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone, while Germany produced around 39,000 throughout the entire war. Such statistics, though impressive, became visceral realities for the captured Hellerinnen through their daily observations of American military operations. Ilse Weber, a communications specialist captured near Kassel, recorded her observations in a diary later recovered by American intelligence officers. "The Americans appear to have an inexhaustible supply of everything," she wrote. "Their trucks run constantly, burning fuel without concern. When a vehicle breaks down, they often simply abandon it and take another. Yesterday, I watched a supply sergeant discard 15 pairs of boots because they showed slight water damage. In Germany, those boots would have equipped an entire platoon, and men would have fought over them." The abundance extended beyond military equipment. Many Hellerinnen remarked on the personal possessions of American soldiers: multiple changes of clothing, watches, cameras, fountain pens, and personal hygiene items that had become rare in Germany. Erika Schmidt, captured near Heidelberg, noted, "Every American soldier seems to have his own toothbrush, razor, and soap. They use fresh water to shave every day, even though we had been told German civilians must conserve every drop." When I mentioned this to our interpreter, she laughed and said, "In America, everyone has running water, even poor people." Perhaps most disorienting was the contrast in health and physical condition. After years of Nazi propaganda emphasizing Nordic physical superiority, many Hellerinnen found themselves face to face with American soldiers who were taller and stronger than the average German. Decades of better nutrition had produced a generation of Americans who were, on average, several centimeters taller than their German counterparts, with the difference becoming more pronounced in the final years of the war as German nutrition deteriorated. "The Negro soldiers are particularly disturbing to our worldview," wrote Helga Brandt, a medical auxiliary. "We were taught they were inferior beings, barely above animals. Yet they are tall, strong, well-fed, and many speak better German than Americans of German descent. They operate complex equipment with confidence and show no signs of the mental deficiency we were told was characteristic of their race." This racial dimension added complexity to the experience of Nazi indoctrinated women. Confronted with African American soldiers who treated them with professional correctness rather than the expected brutal behavior, many experienced profound cognitive dissonance. The racial hierarchies, presented as scientific fact, crumbled before the living evidence to the contrary. This dissolution of racial certainty often preceded and facilitated the collapse of other ideological beliefs. As spring turned to summer in 1945, the situation for captured Hellerinnen evolved. Initial detention centers gave way to more organized internment facilities, with American authorities establishing screening processes to identify women with significant Nazi Party involvement or intelligence value. For most, however, captivity continued to provide daily lessons in American industrial might and logistical capacity. Camp Westbrook, set up in a former Luftwaffe training facility near Wiesbaden, housed over 2,000 female auxiliaries by June 1945. Organized under the supervision of the Women's Army Corps, the facility maintained separate barracks for officers and enlisted personnel, preserving German military hierarchies while introducing decidedly American elements to daily life. Margaret Kunze, a signals lieutenant interned at Westbrook, described the camp's routine. We rise at 6, perform light duties until 4, and then have the evenings to ourselves. The work is nothing compared to our service obligations, mostly cleaning our own spaces and helping in the kitchens. The Americans have established a library with German books, a recreation area, and even show films twice a week. They call this detention, but it's more comfortable than my family's living conditions have been for years. The camp's medical facilities were particularly revealing. Many Hellerinnen arrived with health issues stemming from years of stress and inadequate nutrition, dental problems, amenorrhea, vitamin deficiencies, and untreated chronic conditions. American medical personnel, following standard protocols for prisoner processing, provided treatment that exceeded anything they had received during active service. Dr. Eleanor Simmons, a U.S. Army physician assigned to Camp Westbrook, documented the health status of new arrivals. Approximately 68% present with some form of malnutrition, she wrote. Dental issues are nearly universal, with an average of 3 untreated cavities per patient. Many show signs of past frostbite, particularly those who served on the Eastern Front. Most disturbing are the psychological symptoms: hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, and anxiety, consistent with prolonged exposure to combat conditions. American medical facilities offered antibiotics, analgesics, and vitamins in quantities that seemed wasteful to women accustomed to strict rationing. Dental care, which had become increasingly unavailable to German civilians, was provided as a matter of routine. By July 1945, the average weight gain among Hellerinnen at Camp Westbrook was 4 kg, visible evidence of improved nutrition that could not be explained away by ideological reasoning. The camp's supply systems offered daily demonstrations of American logistical capabilities. Regular deliveries of food, medicine, and equipment arrived with predictable consistency, sharply contrasting with the increasingly erratic supply situations many had experienced in their final months of service. The Americans' ability to maintain steady supply lines through conquered territory challenged the portrayal of Americans as organizationally incompetent. They waste so much, noted Gertrude, a quartermaster assistant. Yet their waste management is strangely efficient. They designate specific areas for garbage, separate different materials, and remove it daily with dedicated vehicles. Even in their trash disposal, they demonstrate organizational capacity beyond anything we maintained at the height of our efficiency. As summer progressed, the daily reality of American abundance continued to break down the last remnants of Nazi indoctrination among the Hellerinnen. American authorities began implementing re-education programs for interned German personnel, including the Hellerinnen. These programs were designed to facilitate denazification and prepare prisoners for eventual reintegration into civilian life. They provided structured exposure to information that had previously been suppressed or distorted by Nazi censorship. One particularly effective tool was the screening of documentary films, footage of American industrial capacity, civilian life, and democratic institutions, along with documentation of Nazi atrocities, provided a comprehensive challenge to the women's remaining ideological commitments. While some women dismissed these efforts as propaganda, many found their growing doubts impossible to ignore in the face of overwhelming evidence. Bridget Hoffmann, a former Nazi Party member who had served as a Nachrichtenhelferin, a signals auxiliary, in France before her capture, described her transformation. The Americans showed us films of their factories. One facility in Detroit produced more vehicles in a month than all of Germany did in the war's final year. They showed us their farms, stores full of goods, and universities open to both men and women. Then they showed us Buchenwald. I vomited and couldn't sleep for 3 nights. Everything had been a lie. Not all experiences were so dramatic. For many Hellerinnen, ideological transformation came more gradually, through countless small revelations rather than single epiphanies. The casual interactions between American personnel of different races, the relative egalitarianism between officers and enlisted men, and the matter-of-fact competence of female military personnel. All these observations slowly chipped away at the worldview constructed by years of Nazi education and propaganda. Letters home, though subject to military censorship, were generally allowed and reveal this incremental transformation. Initially, many women described their American captors in terms consistent with their previous beliefs, emphasizing perceived moral laxity or cultural differences. Over time, these descriptions evolved to acknowledge positive qualities and express doubt about their previous convictions. Helga Fieser, writing to her mother in Munich in August 1945, said, "The Americans continue to surprise me. Last week, they organized a concert with their military band. They played Beethoven and Mozart, not just jazz music as we expected. The conductor, Lieutenant Cohen, spoke passionately about German musical contributions to world culture. This, from a Jewish officer whose family likely suffered under our laws. It forces difficult questions about what we were told." By autumn 1945, American forces began releasing Hellerinnen deemed to present minimal security risks. Many returned to devastated communities and fractured families, carrying with them not just physical evidence of their improved conditions. Restored weight, treated medical issues, small gifts from American personnel, but also transformed perspectives that sometimes caused tension with those who hadn't shared similar experiences. Erica Brown, returning to Hanover in October, faced resistance when describing her experiences. "My father refused to believe me when I told him about the Americans' food supplies. He accused me of exaggerating or being deluded. When I showed him the cigarettes and chocolate I had been given upon release, he insisted these must have been produced in German factories captured by Allied forces. He can't accept that our enemies possessed such abundance while we suffered increasing privation." This disconnect between former Hellerinnen and their communities represented another layer of Germany's collective psychological adjustment. For many civilians who had experienced only the hardships of war and Allied bombing campaigns, the notion of American generosity remained incomprehensible. Women who spoke positively of their treatment in captivity sometimes faced accusations of collaboration or moral compromise. Their changed perspectives were viewed as a betrayal rather than a legitimate reassessment based on direct experience. Louise Hoffman, released from Camp Marshall near Stuttgart in November 1945, recorded the reaction to her return. "My neighbors watch me with suspicion. Because I don't join their bitter complaints about the occupation, they whisper that I must have earned special treatment through dishonorable means. They can't understand that I no longer hate our conquerors. Not because I have forgotten patriotism, but because I've seen with my own eyes that much of what defined our patriotism was built on falsehoods." For American authorities, the experiences of the Hellerinnen offered valuable insights into the psychological dimensions of occupation and reconstruction. Studies conducted by the Strategic Services Unit, the successor to the Office of Strategic Services, analyzed the women's evolving perspectives, identifying factors that either facilitated or impeded ideological transformation. These findings informed broader denazification strategies and helped understand how belief systems collapse when confronted with contradictory evidence. Dr. Margaret Hoffman, a German-born psychologist working with the American military government, interviewed over 300 former Hellerinnen in early 1946. Her report, Transformation of Belief Through Material Evidence, highlighted the particular impact of everyday encounters with American abundance. The report found that abstract political arguments were less persuasive than simple material demonstrations. The availability of hot water, the casual distribution of food, the routine replacement of damaged equipment. These tangible experiences undermined ideological commitments more effectively than direct challenges to Nazi principles. This pattern mirrored broader dynamics in post-war German society. As American occupation policies evolved from initial harshness to the more supportive approach embodied in the Marshall Plan, material reconstruction created conditions for psychological and political rebuilding. The success of democratic market economies, initially visible only to groups like the Hellerinnen with direct exposure to American systems, gradually became apparent throughout Western Germany, facilitating acceptance of new political arrangements. Hedwig Müller, whose dawn encounter with American forces opened this account, exemplified this transformative journey. After 6 months in American custody, she returned to her family in Bavaria with significantly altered perspectives. In 1948, she applied for a civilian position with the American occupation authorities, eventually becoming an administrative assistant at the consulate in Munich. In 1952, she married James Lawrence, a former Army sergeant who had returned to Germany as a civilian contractor. By 1955, they had relocated to Lawrence's hometown of Columbus, Ohio, following a migration pattern taken by approximately 4,000 former Hellerinnen who married American personnel. In a 1977 interview with the Ohio Historical Society, Hedwig Müller Lawrence reflected on her journey. People asked if I was afraid when the Americans arrived. Of course I was. We had been told they would destroy everything we valued. Instead, they shared everything they had. My first chocolate bar, given to me by a soldier, someone who didn't even expect thanks, contained more truth about America than all of Goebbels's speeches. I learned that abundance creates generosity, while scarcity breeds the kind of fear that tyrants use. This is the lesson I carried with me to my new home. The experiences of the Hellerinnen provide a unique historical window into the psychological dimensions of defeat and ideological collapse. Unlike male combatants, whose military surrender occurred in more formalized contexts, these women experienced a more intimate, prolonged confrontation between their indoctrinated expectations and the observed reality. Their testimonies reveal how material evidence, the tangible, undeniable reality of American abundance, undermined abstract ideological commitments more effectively than direct argumentation. This process mirrors broader patterns in Germany's post-war reconstruction. The Wirtschaftswunder of the 1950s, facilitated by Marshall Plan assistance and currency reform, created material conditions that supported political rehabilitation. West Germany's successful integration into democratic institutions and market economies was built upon the same dynamic experienced by the Hellerinnen, practical demonstrations of system effectiveness proving more persuasive than ideological arguments. The historical irony remains striking. Nazi ideology had emphasized material sacrifice for spiritual strength, portraying American abundance as evidence of moral weakness. Yet, when confronted with this abundance, the women discovered not decadence, but organizational competence, industrial capacity, and societal cohesion, the very qualities the Reich had claimed as its unique strengths. The chocolate bars, cigarettes, and K-rations distributed to astonished Hellerinnen contained more than calories. They demonstrated the bankruptcy of a worldview that had defined German identity through its contrast with materialistic enemies. 76 years after these encounters, fewer than 100 former Hellerinnen remain alive, most now in their late 90s. Their experiences, particularly the shock of discovering abundance amid defeat, serve as powerful testimony to the collapse of an ideology based on falsehoods and fear. The gradual transformation of worldview through material evidence and the complex readjustment to post-war society offer valuable insights into how belief systems collapse and reform. The journey from indoctrination through disillusionment to reconstruction exemplifies the larger trajectory of German society in the 20th century. The testimonies of women like the Hellerinnen remind us that ideological commitments, however deeply held, are vulnerable to contradictory evidence, particularly evidence encountered firsthand, rather than through mediated information. The American soldiers who casually distributed chocolate to astonished German women achieved something that Nazi propaganda films could never do. They turned the abstract enemy into a human reality. Lee Mittner, the Austrian physicist who escaped Nazi Germany in 1938, once remarked, "Reality doesn't go away when you stop believing in it." For the Hellerinnen of the Wehrmacht, this truth arrived with American liberation, not as an abstract principle, but in the form of chocolate bars, antibiotics, and functioning trucks. These material experiences defied any ideological commitment that could not explain them away. In their disillusionment, the seeds of reconstruction were planted, as one worldview collapsed to make room for another, one built on more sustainable foundations. Perhaps the final irony is that the Reich's emphasis on material sacrifice accelerated its ideological collapse. By creating artificial scarcity, Nazi leadership set up a contrast that made American abundance all the more shocking and persuasive when directly encountered. The regime that promised greatness through struggle found its former adherents easily converted by simple comforts that were taken for granted in democratic societies. In the end, chocolate bars and hot water proved more powerful than propaganda. They demonstrated that when human needs are satisfied, loyalty becomes more durable than fear and deprivation ever could. For women like Hedwig Miller, the journey from the Wehrmacht to becoming an American citizen was more than just a geographic shift. It represented a profound reassessment of values, priorities, and possibilities. This transformation, initiated by the shock of liberation, was sustained by the demonstrated benefits of alternative social arrangements. In her new home in the Midwest, Hedwig found not the spiritual emptiness that Nazi ideology had predicted, but a community offering dignity, opportunity, and security. This transformation was shared by thousands of Hellerinnen, contributing to the larger rehabilitation of German society and the establishment of peaceful relations between former enemies. When Chancellor Konrad Adenauer visited Washington in 1953, his delegation included 3 former Hellerinnen who had married Americans and become U.S. citizens, a small but symbolic acknowledgement of these women's unique position at the intersection of German defeat and American integration. Their stories remind us that historical transitions don't just happen through formal treaties or political arrangements. They happen through countless personal reckonings with changing realities. The Hellerinnen who watched in astonishment as American soldiers distributed unimaginable abundance experienced defeat not as an abstract national failure, but as a concrete revelation, the disturbing, liberating discovery that everything they had been taught to believe was built on falsehoods. In this revelation lay both trauma and opportunity, the painful collapse of one worldview and the tentative construction of another. Their journey from shock to acceptance and adaptation traces the larger arc of Germany's post-war transformation. This process didn't start with the Marshall Plan or the writing of the Constitution, but with private moments of recognition when individual Germans confronted evidence they could neither deny nor reconcile with previous beliefs. For societies emerging from authoritarian systems, the experiences of the Hellerinnen offer valuable insights. Ideological transformation rarely happens through abstract argument alone. It requires tangible demonstrations of alternative possibilities. The most effective challenge to propaganda is not counter-propaganda, but lived experiences that contradict ideological claims. When people can see, touch, and taste evidence that undermines official narratives, even deeply entrenched beliefs become vulnerable to revision. The testimonies of these women, who witnessed one of history's most dramatic ideological collapses, remain relevant today. Wherever artificial scarcity is imposed for political control or information is manipulated to maintain power structures, the potential for similar revelations exists. Moments when reality breaks through carefully constructed narratives can initiate processes of disillusionment and reconstruction, eventually leading to more sustainable social arrangements. The chocolate bars distributed by American GIs in 1945 carried more than sugar and cocoa. They carried a message about different ways of organizing society. For women raised in a system that valorized scarcity and sacrifice, these simple items represented a profound challenge to everything they had been taught to believe. In their astonishment lay the beginning of a new understanding, that abundance might be more powerful than austerity, that generosity might accomplish what force could not, and that societies organized around material well-being, rather than mythic struggle, might better serve human needs. 76 years later, as the last survivors of that generation pass away, their testimonies serve as a powerful reminder of how quickly seemingly permanent systems can collapse when confronted with contradictory evidence. and how resilient human beings can be in constructing new understandings from the ruins of discredited beliefs.